Good afternoon. I am not going to be dancing on the stage, as Mike Schroeder, Dean Schroeder suggested, but I am here.
I heard him say he was going to do it with you.
Well, that's true. I think he did.
Oh, that I heard too. Now we're talking.
I've been going to encourage him. He's got his dancing shoes ready.
So this is like fun. I mean, if Dean Schroeder gets his golden May pants out, we are ready to go. But while we're waiting for that, I will welcome you here to SIS. I'm the Senior Associate Dean here, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this panel today, Transatlantic Ambassadors, Diplomacy in a Troubled Age. And I'm going to start by introducing my colleague, Dr. Garrett Martin, who is the co-director with Michelle Egan of the Transatlantic Policy Center, which is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the US. He and Professor Egan are the lead faculty of SIS's new partnership with KU Leuven, which we are celebrating today. In fact, we're delighted to welcome a delegation of students and faculty from KU Leuven in our talk today, including Dr. Collier-Rabe here next to Professor Martin. They have not been here for very long, but they've already been out and about. Today, they went to the Center for European Policy Analysis and the Washington Monument. And I hear the elevator did not break, so they're able to go up and down very quickly. It does sometimes do that.
Would you believe I walked up the Washington Monument once?
No, Sally, I
And I was
don't
don't do it.
Yeah, I would recommend not doing it, but I suppose you can run the marathon. Or you have the stamina of Ambassador Shelton-Colby. So anyway, we're happy to have you here. And I want to say this is hopefully the first of many collaborations we can do with KU Leuven. So I'll hand it over to Garrett. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much for everyone here in the room. It's nice to have these in-person experiences again. And thank you to all the people watching on Zoom as well. We're absolutely delighted. This partnership, this experience of a class connected by Zoom most of the time, but also having these immersion components has been a real adventure, Colby, I would say.
Absolutely. We have been together since February in class every Monday. We have been caught in dramatic events, in horrible events. And so transatlantic relations obviously is being asked to produce answers. And we have been following the making of, let's say, the transatlantic relationship, rejuvenated relationship over the last couple of weeks in our class, have been discussing it with our students. And at the same time, they have been bonding, they have been coming together, not only being involved in teaching transatlantic relations, but actually doing and having transatlantic relations. So I think this is a good basis for the future.
Yes, to far more experiences of people-to-people diplomacy, which were in short supply in the past 2 years. So obviously, because of all the dramatic events in the world, that's the title, Diplomacy in a Troubled Age. And we're going to briefly introduce from my left all the way to the right our distinguished panelists today. I'll start first with Mr. Pauw, the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Belgian Embassy, who has had a vast experience already, including being stationed recently at Tehran, and has now been in Washington for 7 months. Next to him, we have Ambassador Piper Campbell, who also distinguished career as an American diplomat, including ambassador to Mongolia, and also a director for the USFP program in the next academic year. Thank you, Ambassador. Next to her, we have Ambassador Garcia-Berdoy, who distinguished Spanish diplomat, most recently as Ambassador Permanent Representative to the European Union, and co-teaching in class currently with our colleague Michelle Egan. And then last but not least, our moderator today, Ambassador Sally Shelton-Colby, with also a distinguished career, working in multiple administrations as ambassador and also as Deputy Secretary General of the OECD with my father. That's just anecdotal, but it's my father's birthday on Wednesday, so I had to give him a shout. So thank you. Thank you so much. We're really looking forward to this panel. And Sally, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Aaron. Now, who would like to go first? We have about 15 minutes per panelist, 12 to 15 minutes before we open it up to questions and answers. So do I have a volunteer or do I need to volunteer someone?
I will
Okay.
volunteer because,
Ladies first.
in a weird way, I feel like I'm the interloper in this panel. So, because the courses I teach are primarily on East Asia. I was ambassador to Mongolia. I was the head of the US mission to ASEAN. So I mostly think about relations in East Asia. So I was thinking about why am I on this panel? I imagine you guys might have been thinking the same thing. And it's not because I once bought a puppy in Leuven, although I did, and named him Duvo, thus starting a trend of naming my dogs after Belgian beers. I now have Stella Artois, and she made Bleu, and I am not kidding. And I think it's also not because I did serve in Belgium, although I did a long, long time ago, in a position which actually took care of all 3 US missions in Brussels, the bilateral embassy between the United States and Belgium, Kingdom of Belgium, the US mission to the EU, as well as the US mission to NATO. But I think that the reason that I'm on this panel is 2 things. The first is that I've spent a lot of my professional career thinking about how we do multilateral diplomacy, primarily with the United Nations, and also then later in my career with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And I find it interesting to think about what are the similarities and differences for the United States doing multilateral diplomacy with the UN and with ASEAN as compared to the ease, not always perfectly easy, but the relative ease that we find dealing multilaterally with the European Union. So I think that might be something that we may develop a little more during the panel. And then the other piece, which I think becomes more glaring every day, and certainly was on full display on Friday when we had the China-EU special summit, is how big a role the question of China's behavior is playing in the US-European dialogue at the moment. And because a part of my focus on China, I hope we'll sort of bring that into the conversation as well.
Let me just make a comment on your comment. I'm glad to hear this because we're discussing Southeast Asia in one of my undergraduate classes day after tomorrow. And you said you were ambassador to ASEAN.
Yes,
We don't study Southeast Asia enough.
that's true.
Southeast Asia I did my master's in Southeast Asian studies. By 2050,
Sally, we're going to be friends.
I think so. By 2050, Southeast Asia will have the equivalent of the 4th largest GDP in the world. What's the population of Southeast Asia roughly? Somewhere around 700 million people, maybe slightly under that. Twice the size of the United States. And another factoid is roughly 50% of Southeast Asia is middle class. So you're not talking about poor countries, you're talking about very high growth. Vietnam, Philippines, especially Indonesia, have just been growing. They're like the new round of Asian tigers.
Yes.
And I would argue that ASEAN doesn't have much political weight, as much as it should, but economic weight it does have. Poor Southeast Asia caught between China and the United States. They don't want to have to choose, and we should not want to make them choose. Sorry, that's mine. Spoke much longer than I expected and took time away from you two. But anyway, I think it's important to put Southeast Asia on your radar screen.
And also, and again, we'll be talking mostly this evening about transatlantic relations, but I will say that the countries of Southeast Asia are very much watching what's happening in the transatlantic relationship and in how the United States and the European Union interact with the Ukraine situation, because that speaks so much to what's going on with the international order, but also it speaks to what they might expect of the United States and the European Union in the future.
Not a single one of the Southeast Asian countries is a democracy. There are 3 partial democracies. Okay. The rest are not free, according to Freedom House. But China's behavior is being watched very, very closely, as is Russia's, as you just said. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. Now, which of the two?
I'll defer to the ambassador.
The ambassador,
first.
okay.
I'm the lowest in
No.
rank, so I come last.
I was thinking that maybe starting to talk about transatlantic relation, spending 10 minutes talking about the Pacific was not a good beginning. But anyway, I think it was just the fact that we all have personal stories with Southeast Asia. Also, I was
Yes.
posted the Philippines, so I'm very, very much interested in the region. But today we should be talking about what are we going to do together, the US and Europe, in the coming years. And my take is the following. I was ambassador, as Garrett said, I was ambassador in the EU until very recently. Before that, immediately before that, I was ambassador in Berlin, in Germany, and I have been doing EU policies most of my career, except this small period in Manila. I was ambassador in Bucharest also, and in Moldova. So I try also to cover that Eastern European region, which is today more important than ever. My question to the public, if I may say so today, is whether we think that what is happening in the world now does affect us internally or only in our projection towards third countries. This is my main intake in this juncture. That if we don't draw the lessons of this huge crisis in relation to our transatlantic dialogue, then we have learned nothing, and we don't deserve to be, let's say, the rule makers of the world, which is what we pretend as advanced economies, liberal countries, democracies, etc. So, first of all, the Russian aggression, the war, but also climate change, digital, all these new trends in international relations have to be a part of the core, the kern, the center of the discussion between Washington and Brussels. And they have to be probably in a different way as it was before, because I'm afraid that the system that we set up, or you set up, as I said, after the Second World War, is not functional now. And I'm not saying it's not functional anymore, but it's not functional now. And we have to invent, at least for the periods, the years to come, a new system that will protect our values and our objectives, which are shared. And this is still not there. And of course, I love hearing about the importance of the Pacific, which is absolutely evident that it's in the center of things for the reasons that you have so well explained. But first of all, we have to think, with whom do we share most? How can we be really trying to shape the world in a way that is not, I would say, following our path or following our trends, but sharing our values, at least in the way that we think we can have a constructive dialogue with other regions of the world. Because we know that we have that in the transatlantic dialogue, but we are not sure. Actually, we know that we don't have that in other parts. So first, is this crisis going to change radically the transatlantic dialogue? And when I say radically, it's this crisis going to bring some more meat to the bone of the transatlantic dialogue. The second question is, if we answer yes, how do we proceed? Are we going to stay in this case-by-case scenario, which we are now? Are we going to just trust that other administrations, both here or there, will share the same transatlantic values? Or do we have to set up a new architecture in order to be more solid in our permanent defense of our values and our interests? The third, if we talk about things which are not like accidents in history or tragedies that occur or crimes that we are witnessing. We talk about things which are more positive, things that are common goals. And I'm thinking about the environment mainly, which is one of our biggest challenges. Are we really armed to confront that battle properly? Do we have to set up new things in order to be able to defend what we think is a common interest? So these are, for me, the questions that unite us. But also inside our societies, have we lost this general consensus that both sides of the Atlantic share, more than in any other region of the world, the values, the objectives, the interests? Are we really internally sure that we are still on that page? I'm not sure about that. And because I'm not sure about that, I think what we do externally has a tremendous effect in what our societies will talk internally. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, Ambassador. And I think I have, if I may take the liberty of trying to interpret what you're hinting at, I think I have lived through two specific concrete examples of where these things might be in friction, where this transatlantic unity that you have might be in friction. I was posted in Jerusalem, so not Israel, but Jerusalem, Corpus Separatum, and I was posted in Iran. Israel was 2013 to 16, Iran was 2018 to just now, the summer of 21. Two periods of crisis. Israel-Palestine conflict flared up again under the fourth, I think, Gaza war. While we were there, we had the so-called knife intifada. We had the car intifada during that time. We had a number of issues with Israel taking away European development aid programs or European development systems, water wells, schools, toilets, things like that, and taking them, destroying them, confiscating them, and then sort of making the dialogue between the European partners and Israel very difficult, and the US not really stepping in to put it very bluntly. Iran, a similar or a comparable maybe scenario where you have, in essence, a conflict where Iran and the US are opposite each other. There's a maximum pressure being installed onto or being laid over the Iranian society, Iranian economy, with the secondary effects of sanctions, making it completely impossible for European member states to continue their own relationships with Iran, which they had. They had them for a long time. Belgium in particular, just to name a specific example, we've been working with Iran since the 60s in textiles. So any woven carpet, I think 75% or so of the woven carpets, not the hand woven ones, the machine woven ones, I mean, coming out of Iran have been produced on a Belgian produced mill. So that alone has a long history. There's a lot of know-how that has gone into that. All of a sudden, this Iran-US conflict and the sanctions, the maximum pressure, makes it really difficult for us to continue that trade, although there is nothing wrong with that trade. We are not supporting a terrorist regime with that. We are not paying money to the IRGC. It's the middle class. There is a vibrant trade going on. All of a sudden, it becomes impossible. It even becomes impossible for the embassy to pay its bills. And so you end up finding me driving across the border into Azerbaijan to go collect cash money to come back with 70,000 euros. Don't tell anyone. I know this is online, but this is Chatham House rules. Do not tell anyone. Driving back with 70,000 euros in cash in the back of my car and 300 kilos of cat food also. But that's another story. In my car to take it back to Tehran just to be able to pay our bills, just to be able to pay our staff, to make it possible to operate as an embassy, where we should be exempt from the effects of such sanctions. We are in a different universe when it comes to that. So what my experience has been, and this is a very black and white, but I hope straight to the question of this transatlantic bond that we're being that we're seeing reinvigorated again and rejuvenated again. My experience is that in those two particular situations, it was a very skewed relationship, with one dictating the terms of how it was going to be and the other one complying or following or doing nothing, abstaining for the peace of, for the better peace of. I think that with the Ukraine crisis today is something that I hope we will not have to repeat. I hope that for Europe, this means the realization that we need a stronger autonomy in terms of defense, a stronger autonomy in terms of trade. I mean, the European Union, if there is one thing that the European Union can do without having to wait for 27 consensus votes, it's trade, right? That's the one thing where we are independent, and we decide to put it in the fridge just because the US decides to work out the beef it has with Iran. That is not a partnership. That is an
unhealthy partnership.
A master pupil or something like that. I don't know what it is, but it's not an even balanced partnership that I think, or that I hope at least, that the current crisis, because it brings the situation so close to home for us. It is right there. Belgium at the moment already has taken in over 30,000 Ukrainian refugees. We're moving on to 35,000. We're aiming for 200,000. We hope, of course, that it will not be necessary and that the whole problem will be, well, maybe not solved, but at least put to rest and can then be solved. But 200,000 for a 10 million or 11 million people country compared to the 100,000 that the Americans are going to take in. Also there, it tells you the scope, the dimensions of what we, from a European perspective, are looking at. And I hope it's a signal for us within the European Union to first and foremost decide what our priorities are, what we need to be secure, what we need to be able to operate. And on that level, from that platform, be able to reestablish or reconnect with the US, which I think now happens because everyone is happy that we have another administration than the previous administration that is really welcome and open to working with the EU. So that makes a lot of things much easier, but there are no guarantees. The US is a democracy that is going to go its own way. And so in that sense, we need to anticipate that. We need to be able, or not even anticipate that. We need to be able to let that happen, to let the US go its own way, to let the US make its choices. We are not imposing anything, but we can't take all the flack from it either, which I think we have, especially under the previous administration. We've taken a lot of hits as EU, and that was, I think, not, well, there's a lot of things to be said about the EU, and I'll let the ambassador do that for me because he knows it intimately and much better. There's a lot of things to be said against the EU, but in situations like these, Ukraine, for instance, there's a lot of things you can say about the EU that are really impressive too. When it comes to it, we take decisions. When it comes to it, we come together. When it comes to it, we send people, money, medicine, military. It's there. So when the crisis is flagrant enough, so to speak, that we wake up, we can work. And that's a thing I think that we need to take with us. This flame has been kindled and we need to take it along to establish a relationship that is perhaps a bit more balanced, because that is the relationship, that is the grouping that we will need to work in the future with. That is the grouping that is throughout the 20th century, I think, and 19th century, it's much older than that, has grown into an organic sort of relationship that is the core for us to tackle the rest of the world problems with. And with that, that's very explicit, very black and white. So now you can all shoot your questions at us. I'll take the flag. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all three of you. I am going to take advantage of being here and having the floor to ask a security question. Clearly, everyone is worried about European security. But the transatlantic relationship, and specifically Europe, is facing another range of issues that I wonder if I'd appreciate some comments on how effectively the European Union will be able to handle these security threats. I'm talking specifically about the rapid growth of extremism in the Sahel, not just the Sahel, but it's going up and down the east coast of Africa, not to mention only the Sahel, but also the west coast of Africa. The French have announced a total pullout of troops from Mali. What is Europe going to do, and what would Europe expect the US to do to help deal with this? We never expected a 9/11 to come out of a place called Afghanistan. It did. It happened again. Secondly, the Arctic poses not only environmental challenges, I would argue, but also security challenges, as Russia is very much asserting itself. You probably know it's reopened 10 or 12 military bases that are closed when the Cold War was over, and it's now patrolling, planted a flag, Russian flag on the floor of the Arctic. And indeed, China seems not yet to have developed a security strategy for the Arctic. I frankly think we should not take our eye off Antarctica. Grad students last semester interested. I couldn't get them interested in Antarctica. So I had to do it. I had to do the research on Antarctica. And I got fascinated by Antarctica. A number of European countries and the US have research stations in Antarctica, as does China. And China is breaking many norms. My last security challenge relates to trade. I am a convinced free trader. You'll never convince me that free trade does not lift all boats. But in the United States, the Democratic Party seems to have refused to recognize that. Republican Party, depending on which way it goes in 2024, may not embrace free trade, certainly didn't during the last Republican administration. And I don't know where transatlantic trade is going to go with the breakdown of TTIP. Well, these many years ago. So will the Atlantic relationship be able to effectively handle these disparate and newish challenges to our mutual security?
On the table, so many things which are from different filières, if I may say so.
Okay, if you know it.
Yeah, I'm no doubt.
European trade with China. How's Europe going to deal with the China challenge?
Well, the thing is that what you're talking about is about things which are very relevant. Some of them are not the priorities of today. Recognize the importance. And I would concentrate on two things. I would say, the trade issue. And one thing which is, for me, much more important than the, let's say, territorial challenges that we have in both poles. Of course, they're very important. But the setting of the norms. Because I don't know whether we realize that with this crisis, what we are questioning is who is setting the norms. We have, and this is not innocent, where we are now, a World Trade Organization that doesn't work anymore. Europeans, I must say, the fate here is quite clear according to my view.
The US.
No, I didn't say that.
No, but I did.
We have a limited ambition in our trade relations, not because the US has limited ambitions in trade relations, because everywhere the Chinese status has destroyed the faith in free and fair trade. And one has to recognize that there was a revolution in trade relations that has nothing to do with our bilateral relations, but was provoked by probably a well-intentioned idea to include China in the economic system in I think in a very candid way. All in all, and I leave the other questions to my colleagues here in the panel, what it enforces is the idea that we have to talk seriously on a, let's say, fair and as my Belgian colleague has said, respectful way of each other's interests and competences. But we have to talk also seriously about our limits to engage the world in what we want to engage.
Mm-hmm.
So my first remark is always here. Do you really think you need Europe? And the answer I get in Washington is not very clear. It still is not very clear. Do you think you need Europe to conform the world, not completely, but in a way which is according to what we think it should be, at least in its main traits? And the first thing I'm waiting here in Washington is to hear that really people are convinced that not because of this crisis, but because of the relevant structural issues that are coming to both the US and the EU. The US is convinced that they need us to do, let's say, a kind of world setting, if I may say so. And this is the precondition. And I don't like this, how you call that, the saucissonnage, no? Of
Sausage slicing.
yeah, of the policies. Because this is something that we get in the US very often, that you cut the pieces and you choose this and that one, because these are the ones that are really of your interest. What I want, and this is, excuse me if I use this word, the holistic approach, which is a terrible word, the holistic approach of our bilateral relations as two blocks that are co-responsible of many things that are happening in the world. And this, and not the pick and choose approach, is what I need before getting into it.
Reminding me of a famous saying by someone like Bismarck: those who love law and sausage should see neither made.
To build on those comments, one thing that I was thinking about is the very basic question as to whether the United States and the European Union have the same interests and the same threat assessment. And I would have to answer that and say no. I don't think that we do have the exact same, or even sort of 90% similarity in either of those interests, the ranking of interests, or the ranking of threats. And that makes a partnership more difficult, including because I think that the fact that we don't have fully transparent ranking of interests and threats and discussion on that. I think that that is a challenge innate challenge to the relationship. The other, to me, innate challenge to the relationship is that from a US perspective, we don't always know when we should or would be talking to the European Union as the decision maker versus when we would be should be talking or could be talking to individual countries. And I think that we need to be honest in this conversation and say that that is a challenge that the countries of Europe sometimes foster. When it is in a country's interest to speak as that country, they often will speak bilaterally with the United States. When it's in their interest to represent an EU position, they will do that. And American diplomats and policymakers are subtle enough and fly enough to recognize this and to look at where those cracks are, where the margins are, and to use those margins when it's in our interest. And so if you talk to a single European country that has an interest that seems more aligned with the US interest versus the professed position of the European Union, then that creates a real challenge across the relationship. So a question that I was mulling over was whether the situation in Ukraine, whether it had actually brought the countries of Europe closer together and therefore was creating a situation where the European Union as a voice to a consolidated or block of countries was being a more effective voice right now. And if that's part of what's allowing a more effective US-EU conversation at the moment. Because I would say a few years ago, the US-EU conversation, there wasn't a lot of meat there. It was more a US bing, bing, bang, talking to different countries conversation.
I would follow up on that and saying that I think the responsibility goes both ways also, of course. There's a political choice also on the American side to either talk to the EU or talk to the E3 or the E4 or the E2 or the E1 or the E27 and then the UK. Like you say, it's yes, we display all sorts of fissures, and those are easy to exploit, to use, to maximize. Absolutely, but it could also be an explicit and political choice to not do that. And I think the way the EU has behaved has grown throughout the COVID crisis, for instance, is where we've gained a certain strength as EU. The way the EU has developed its behavior and its reactions throughout the current war with Russia and Ukraine, also we've shown ourselves to be a pretty strong player potentially. But that doesn't hide the fact that coming to a position by finding a consensus between all member states is not an easy way of doing business. And Belgium, for one, is a proponent of a qualified majority approach rather than the 27 consensus votes that you need to be able to implement and develop a foreign policy. So we would very much like to see a number of reforms within the system and the decision-making of the EU to make it stronger, make it more lenient, and make it the one sole player, potentially. How we will get there, I have no answer to that. I'm afraid that's going to be a long process still, although it might be expedited now by current experiences. We do need some reforms, but it would also be nice to see some commitment from the other partners to work with the EU and not with the E3 when it fits them. So there's a shared responsibility. As to Mali and Western or Northern Africa, yes, we definitely have a problem there. We have a problem from an EU perspective or European continental even perspective, beyond the EU. We have a problem. Our whole neighborhood to the south and to the east is being turned into a problem zone for our integrity, our security, our viability. I think also economically, we are put under stresses of migration. We're put under stresses of conflicts on all sides. There are mercenaries to the south and to the east and all around us. I don't have a ready-made answer on will we be able to deal with that. But perhaps we should be willing to look at that problem to try and deal with that not on American terms, not on terms that enhance your security first, but enhance European security first, and then we can extend that. A lot of the problems in the discussion, I think, stem from the fact that the discussion or the dance is being led by the US, not so much by us. And so it's maybe not the steps that we're accustomed to. We don't know how to do this dance very well. And we need to develop our own dance, I think. But that's, again, very black and white. So that's for the sake of the discussion.
No, I think it's what you say is very clear that we have a problem ourselves, also from kind of profiling ourselves in this conversation, putting ourselves the means and objectives that we need. I think the kind of Kissinger remark of who I call the telephone number, that sort of thing, I think that's more or less over. No, I mean, I don't think that it's such a good idea to have a poor US president in many European councils, because he will get very bored, and we know the Obama experience that was not very successful. But all in all, the dialogue, the channels of dialogue are already pretty much more clear than they were before. And I think, of course, you can say, you can talk to Berlin, you can talk to Paris, you can talk to the governor here, you can talk to, you know. So there are many things that could be done or could be avoided. But the channels are clear. The ways and means to have a fruitful dialogue are there. So it's not a problem of structure anymore. It could have been a problem before, but not anymore. The problem is, I think, and I connect with what my Belgian colleague is saying, it's the will of really taking us seriously in terms of sharing our concerns in a fair way. And this is something that we also have to do. Because I mean, I'm not saying that we are innocent in that respect, and we have been extremely, in some cases like China, probably there has been a kind of a hesitation in our reflection because of very objective national interest. But all in all, after this crisis, what cannot be accepted is that this reflection is not the reflection of how are we going to speak to each other as adults that take seriously to each other. And this is what I still don't see that in the general framework. I see that sectorial, maybe the digital world now is taking us seriously after some regulation in Europe that were quite efficient. Maybe the environmental issues are more and more shared here than they were a few years ago, which are transcendental issues and very extremely important. Why don't we increase the scope of our common conversation?
Is EU expansion going to continue?
It's enlargement, I would say.
Enlargement.
Sounds a bit.
It's not imperial.
Exactly.
Yes. moment, but I mean, I again should defer to the expert on the panel here. But frankly, at this moment and at this point in time, I doubt it. It's we need to build better sticking rules internally. We need to strengthen our own procedures before we can join, or at least, I mean, if this is a trick question as to whether we will let Ukraine join tomorrow.
That's my next question.
He's very clever. He
My-
saw that you're coming.
My government's position on this is that yes, they have revealed themselves to be really valiant fighters that deserve all our respect. They are fighting for us. They are fighting for freedom. That is all very clear. But that does not 1, 2, 3 translate into membership VIP to the European Union. I mean, I've been frank before, so I'll be frank again. Up until October, November, we were raising all sorts of issues about Ukraine and the need for reforms. And then in March, these issues would be gone, like poof. Of course, they're not. And so I think it's essential that, let's say, the engagement to open a path for Ukraine should be a principled one and should be one of belief almost. But the procedural development of that, I think, has to be according to what the basics, the fundamentals of the EU system are, and have to, the membership or the member candidate rather has to sort of respond to these, has to be able to live up to these levels before we can continue to work. Otherwise, it's going to drag us all down in the end, which is exactly what Putin is aiming for.
There is an element adding to that is, I mean, there is a misunderstanding. Enlargement is not a foreign policy tool. Enlargement is a constitutional issue. We define ourselves as a quasi-federal state in terms of EU, and enlargement defines the size of this quasi-federal state. It's as if saying that because you have a foreign policy issue, you will have another state in the union. Not, these things are more complicated than that because it's defining ourselves, what we are as European Union. So it's I wouldn't and I subscribe completely what he said. I mean, this is a procedures and it's an internal issue that is. I mean, we depend the future of the stability of its member states and of the compatibility of the member states.
The willingness and ability of the member states to respect the EU's norms.
Exactly.
Not all countries are
To
doing.
embody them, not just respect them, not just respect and behave differently for yourself. No, you have to embody them. You have to have in your own country the system and the apparatus and the institutions that embody exactly these things, and that will allow you to, if we're talking euro, that the bed has to be there for the euro to grow and to flourish in that economy and so on. So you really need to embody it. You need to be able to incorporate it into your own society before you can be glued on to the rest of the club.
Yes, I was just going to say, I was looking around for Garrett and I don't see him. Oh, there he is. Is that okay to start the Q&A a little early? All right. Yes, at the very back. Could you stand up and identify yourself and address your question to either one or all of the ambassadors?
My name's Alex. I'm a PhD student here at the School of International Service. Thank you all for being here. And this question could be for any of the panelists. There are important elections coming up in France. The polling that I've seen shows Macron's lead is decreasing to Marine Le Pen. So what does that mean? What would a Le Pen win mean for not only US-French relations, but US-EU relations, especially in light of what we have seen, at least in Western Europe, of a coming together to counter Russia? My knowledge is Le Pen has been sympathetic in the past to Putin. So I'm hoping you could speak to that.
on a question, which is probably not a normal panel protocol, but I found myself thinking about how healthy are the EU mechanisms right now to self-police, so that when you encounter situations, I'm thinking a bit of Hungary, where you have a country which is solidly currently within the European Union, but isn't necessarily embodying those principles. How do you feel about the EU's mechanisms and capabilities to address those? And I ask that in part because it also ties to the question of how the United States thinks about the European Union as a partner.
The second part of the question is a bit more tricky, because you are connecting the two issues in a way which I think it's quite unfair to us. There are quite solid mechanisms that unfortunately do not allow us to throw away a member state. But let me tell you frankly, I think we have shown during the crisis, when even the Visegrad countries were together in opposition to the rest of the member states, or to some of the majority of the member states, we have shown that the European Union as a whole has always behaved according to the rules that we have set up to represent inside and outside. So we have never diminished our will and our action in defending human rights or values or free market or whatever, name it, just because we had 2, 3, 4 member states which were not completely 100% following what the majority said. So I wouldn't like that, and this is a fear I have since yesterday, I wouldn't like to see that Hungary becomes an excuse not to tackle the dialogue in an intensive way, because we share the same values. But I wouldn't pinpoint a member state that is now, for reasons that they very, very long to explain, but we could do it thoroughly, not on the same mainstream as the rest of the council, because it would.
Or Poland. More problematic in a way.
But Poland now, because Poland is not in the radar because of the relation with Russia, it doesn't seem to be so focused. No, let's put it this way. So this pick and choose thing about you have to listen to us as a, let's say, as a group that is not an international organization in the classical way, that has a voice that is represented by the Commission, by the President of the Council, by the statements, by the actions, by the rules, by the regulations that we do. And there you will see our values, our shared interests. The rest is, as in any country, including the US, a minority expression of something that we, the majority, don't share. So this is for me extremely important. The other question, which was
About France.
about France.
Yeah, but
We are both neighbors, but I mean, he's more neighbor.
so that's a really good question, and I think you can't see it separate from perhaps Hungary, but even more Germany. If you're looking at the EU and you're looking at the historic engine of the EU, it's the French-German relationship. And for a while there, with Merkel gone, you saw a hyperactive France trying to sort of fill the void, fill the vacuum. Not to say that France is not often hyperactive. So it's a trait of them, makes it very sympathetic. So you saw them trying to fill a certain void. Now the new German chancellor has had a chance, and I think he's taken it, that chance to fill that void. He has stepped up big time. Zeitenwende in Germany over the Ukraine war, the Ukraine crisis, has been extremely impressive.
It's been amazing.
Yes, it was totally unexpected, I think, in many ways, and he carried it off. So he is back in the scales to balance things off. Should a France go off the rails, to put it bluntly. That said, Macron losing in France would probably be a huge sort of emotional setback. But Le Pen would still have, she would still have a country to run. She would still have to run a country. That's what I mean. Her job would still be to run a huge country, an important economy, and an important European decision maker. And I think that sort of draws everything a little bit back to the center.
That's what we said about Donald Trump.
Yeah, I know. Yes, that was hoping.
No longer in government, I get to say things like
That was hope against hope, maybe, but it's true. We have, in that sense, I think with, for instance, Hungary, what the ambassador was pointing at, they have their own voices, they have their own inclinations and their own tendencies, but in the end, we're still together, and there are procedures that allow the EU as an institution or as a complex to draw these countries back in and to draw these positions back in. And that's why I pointed at Poland. Poland, we now have a problem with Poland on the judicial level, Supreme Court sort of material. That doesn't prevent Poland from doing what it's doing currently within the EU and NATO. It's the bigger umbrellas, but it is really stepping up on the Ukrainian thing, and it's taking a strong European position also on, or it's making the European position stronger on these issues. So it's not an either or. It's not, oh, now we're totally going to go off the cliffs. I don't think so. But it would be in the current crisis, in the current period of unpredictability and upheaval, it would probably make things easier if you have a certain continuum, especially in France and Germany, where you could sort of predict things a little bit better. But that's how democracies work. So we'll have to find it out as we go along, I guess.
Professor Martin has just asked me to remind those of you who are participating virtually that you too can ask questions. So I think they'll get your question.
I'll keep an eye out.
Okay, good.
Moderate.
Let's see. I think you're next, I think.
I'm Michael Nelson at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You mentioned the E5 and the E2 and the E3, and you mentioned talking to governors. So I want to make this even more complicated. What's the role of region to region or region to state diplomacy? Your two countries are among the most decentralized, along with Canada and the United States. There's a lot to be done with California talking to Bavaria, Catalonia talking to Detroit. What do you think? Is there progress to be made there, or does that make things even more complicated?
Let's take it a Belgian version.
Well, I should point out that Belgium did set a record, a world record for the longest time without a national government.
Without collapsing.
I think that's the point.
We need to keep going. But indeed, it's largely because we have so many governments within our tiny country that we were able to sort of muddle through in these 550, whatever, 60 something days. It's largely because, well, in our case, literally the center didn't hold, but it didn't matter that much because we've gone through 5 cycles of government reform since the 60s that have gradually sort of unfolded or folded over the federal, the central into the regional. And so the regional has now has competencies where we can no longer touch as federal. Education, trade, climate, unfortunately, which explains why we were not able to go to Glasgow with our pants pulled up tightly, We did not reach a climate deal amongst all the players within Belgium. So we do trip over ourselves very often. And there's a steep learning curve to be had. But our regional diplomacy, I think, is getting stronger. The focus is still very much on trade. It could be wider. It could be on education, could be academic exchange, but it is getting stronger. It works well at best. It works well with the federal, where the one reinforces the other or tries to reinforce the other. So I'm not entirely convinced as yet, but I'm not pessimistic that it will be taken over. I think that also the global world, yes, we still are in a system where nation states play a crucial role. But when it comes to questions like climate, health, pollution, food security, things like that, we're talking regions and we're talking cities most of all.
Exactly.
And so that almost by definition will evolve, will have things evolve.
I think this is a very important element, and well, we have 17 regions, so it's even more difficult to manage in many ways. But I think one of the key elements that is not still there is the role of the cities, the role of the municipalities, which is very unfair, because if you think about the social services nowadays, think about the policies, active policies, many of them are done by the municipalities. So in this political dialogue that I admire the Belgian complexity, and I say that no, very candidly, I admire the way they are able to handle this complexity, and the way that the country is doing very well. It's a fantastic, amazing country. In our case, it's more complicated because of this asymmetric Catalonia, the Basque Country, Galicia, which are the three traditional, let's say, more nationalistic regions, and then the others. But I think what it really, both in Belgium and Spain, still is not clear, is this international role of the cities, which should be enhanced and which should be taken into account in a different way. So the Committee of the Regions doesn't play a major role. So we have to think about that. But also both in Belgium and in Spain, our internal processes are not perfect. We have problems, it's clear. But I think it's a path we have to follow.
I think about this also from a US perspective. And when I was serving in Mongolia, I was interested to learn that Mongolia is almost exactly the same size as the state of Alaska, and has quite similar populations, about 3 million each. Both Mongolia and Alaska are larger than the European Union. Now, they each have about 3 million people. The European Union has a few more. But it makes sense that, that Mongolia would interact with an Alaska, an area that understands many of the challenges. Yeah. And on both sides, there was a real interest. And so we did a lot with state-to-state, state-to-country partnerships and things like that. But you think about the size, for example, the size of California's economy. And I've seen the figure of how many countries that California's economy is larger than some X% of countries' economies in the world. Yeah. So it's not, I think it's important. You've mentioned asymmetries, but there's also the question of symmetries, when you can find things that are like, and you can build on those likenesses and benefit from them. And I think the cities is another example of that. As Singapore and another major city, they have so many of the same challenges. And so diplomacy has to work on so many different levels.
Absolutely.
All right, yes, you had your hand up.
Hello, my name is Henry Fix. I'm a first-year student majoring in international studies, so this is my first in-person lecture event. So thank you. So my question has to do with something that I feel like was touched on throughout the panel. I'd just like to focus a bit more on. So I got the overarching sense that the current system of the way that we're handling diplomacy isn't adequate, it's not sustainable, and something needs to be done to architect a better one. I heard mentions of specifically of autonomy going about doing that. But one of the problems that I studied both last semester and this semester in my intro international studies classes is that the international order, as time goes on, has become so fractured by different organizations and sub-organizations. It was specifically talked about with the EU, all these different bodies that countries can go to instead of one centralized system. And it's making systemic change, substantive change, harder than ever to achieve. So I guess my question is, from a practical sense, how do we go about making diplomacy and systemic change more efficient in a very modernized and fractured international order?
Are you talking from my class? It's maybe my fault. Are you in my class?
I am, yeah.
I think Henry has to drop the proverbial mic.
Apparently, we're very cynical at teaching them to.
Who wants to make a try?
Well, just two remarks. I mean, European Union is a way of simplifying international dialogue, because I mean, we just conglomerate so many different interests that for once, I mean, Europe can speak in international issues with the same voice. That is my remark. The second remark is about the inadequacies of the international order today, because I mean, the Security Council is a fine example. You know? If you have veto power, you don't go on. So let's forget it. I mean, we have a system that doesn't work in the way that it was conceived. So all in all, what my remark would be, let's think, and I am I'm more optimistic than you are. I think we have all in all more things that unite us. That it's, I mean, I think we have a common interest. If you ask the population in the US about the environment, we have common interest about issues that are related to, with different approaches to security, to peace, to even to social issues. We think they're different in both. So that we start talking to each other in a serious way about all these issues. Let's start talking the people you know better now. And then let's see if there are other who will join in. But let's start talking between ourselves more intensively.
And perhaps if I may add, check the press conference that von der Leyen and Michel did after the EU-China summit. And the position that von der Leyen is defending there is to exactly rely more and stronger on the system that we've built, rather than under the pressures of externalities, let's put it that way, try and adapt the systems. I'm sort of compressing now what she said, but her plea was very strong in relation to China, was very strong for, we have an international order, and Russia, we have an international order, we have systems for dealing with disagreements, for dealing with differences in positions and in takes. We can go to courts, we can go to Security Council, we can go to a number of institutions, let's say, or gatherings where exactly the procedures to decide on these differences are there. So why not use them rather than try and reinvent them? That's also an element to take along. I'm not saying it's going to be simple, because the Security Council, it's 5, and if one is being obnoxious, nothing happens. So that's a problem. But it doesn't mean that you have to throw the kid out with the bathwater.
We have a virtual question.
We actually have two even, so I'm going to try to answer them consecutively. The first one is actually a former student of yours, Corey Scott, who is asked. I'm just reading. So the Corey's asking, with essentially thinking about sort of juggling different responsibilities with the focus on Europe because of the war in Ukraine. To what extent does that give opportunity to China and other powers to take advantage in other parts of the world? He uses the example of the Caribbean, but I presume in the Indo-Pacific, where, you know, obviously Ambassador Campbell, you've worked a lot, and that was a big talk about the EU and others focusing on that area. So how do you juggle all of those different areas? And the second question was about the EU recently published its first strategic compass, essentially a large strategic roadmap. What impact, the anonymous attendee is asking, will that have on transatlantic relations?
Good questions.
You know, I mean, to the first one, without being overly simplistic, I would say that there's never been a time when we've only been dealing with one major challenge. And you can look back at any 5-year period, really over the last 100 years, and you can identify 2 or 3 major things that are going on at the same time. I think that news cycles and social media, et cetera, really don't reflect that. But just as we've got the problem in Ukraine right now, we've got problems in other parts of the world that are not getting the attention they should on the front page of the paper. But it doesn't mean that people in government aren't looking at them. That's part of the answer. The other part would be, I share the concern that about bandwidth, which I think is part of what the question was about. And there's certainly a fair amount of discussion right now as to whether the situation in Ukraine, the focus on Europe and Eastern Europe and Russia, with the extent to which that's drawing attention, US attention away from Asia, attention and resources. And it's a very real concern. But if we can't walk and chew gum, if we can't as a government deal with multiple crises simultaneously, then we need to build better systems, because the demand is always going to be there to deal with multiple crises simultaneously.
Anybody want to add on to?
Well, perhaps on the strategic compass, if I may, which is the second question, I guess. I believe it'll strengthen. The question was, to what extent will it help or change the transatlantic relationship? I believe it will strengthen the transatlantic relationship. There is a clear commitment on the part of the EU now to commit more money, commit more troops, to make them complementary, or what do you call it, interdependent. So in that sense, if it all works out, if reality looks anything like it's been conceived on paper, it'll be a stronger, it'll be for the better.
Yeah, let me add something, because this is a very nice understatement. If reality proceeds with the paper. I think there is an element which is to our absent it's not viewers and people who are listening to us might consider also as an element which is as them not present in the discussion today. What do we do in defense and security in terms of EU? And there, this is a work in progress. But one element that you should take into account is the importance of the European armies as a whole. The importance of the amount of money the European taxpayer invest in defense, but the lack of efficiency of that expenditure. So one of the key issues for the EU of today is to make that expenditure much more efficient. That is to say, to look for the complementarities, to look at the synergies, to look where we spend better industrially together, to look at things that are very much related to, let's say, the internal market at large. And there, people might think, but this is soft policy. This is not a serious issue. No. It's as it happened in the US with the big defense providers, it made the whole difference. At the end of the day, you get not only an efficient defense capability, but you get a system that is feeding itself because it has a technology, the capacity of inventing and developing new products, and this is very important. So this is something that is related to the strategic compass in the sense that it describes security issues that are common to all of us and that we have to focus on them collectively.
Yes. Over here.
Thank you for this very interesting panel. I just wanted to build on.
Your name is?
Yes, sorry. I'm Annie Nielsen. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm originally from Belgium too. Yeah, about this idea of a European defense you talked about. I just wanted to hear your thoughts, any of you, about how the US would welcome this idea of a European defense, also in relation to NATO, how it would increase or decrease its role. Yeah, about this transatlantic defense and European defense.
Thank you.
Well, we had many issues at the given time regarding some of our projects in the PESCO field and also in the European Defense Fund because of some clauses. And I have to be very frank with you. We were deciding at that time where the taxpayer money of the European would be invested. I mean, frankly, everybody in this country would understand that we thought that it was logical that we had a preference for companies that were doing things in Europe. I'm not saying even European companies. Some of the clauses of the regulations allow non-European companies, but are active in the European, with European investment and with European activity, to be part of this, to be beneficiaries of that money. So sometime there was a misunderstanding here on this side of the Atlantic, what we meant by this European preference, which was the logical thing that as you do here, we would do the same in Europe. Having said that, what we could also share as a common request, and we understand that we have to take on board in terms of GDP more effort in our own defense, and that is an obvious challenge for all European governments, but rightly so. I mean, I think I can understand that debate. What I wouldn't understand is that from the US part, there would be objections to the increased capabilities in defense by European industries paid by European taxpayers. That would be simply patronizing us in an unacceptable way.
On the issue of defense, I'm going to throw out an idea which you all may totally reject. I have come around to really feel very strongly about this, that the 2% of GDP metric is ridiculous. Oh my goodness, I'm seeing some heads nod.
Some people leaving too.
Too, that's right. Don't take it personally. I think it does not capture the strength of a country's military. Denmark, for example, is around 1.4%, I think, maybe now to 1.5. It's got one of the best militaries in the European Union. One of my grad school classmates was Assistant Secretary General of NATO, and for 2.5 years he was acting Secretary General of NATO. And he told me that his staff came up with a very interesting statistic. US spends somewhere between 3 and 4% of GDP on NATO. It's about 3 now, but it has been as high as 4, 10 during the Cold War. But only 12% of US spending on defense is spent in the Atlantic theater. So I don't know, some of you bright young people maybe can come up with a more meaningful metric than 2% of GDP.
Yeah, and you're right, and capabilities and not personnel. And then, so if you do the menu, it's very complicated.
There was somebody, yes, you had your hand up.
Hi, I'm Shi, and I'm an undergraduate student from China. And I just want to ask a question. It's like, as you guys said before, like the US and EU is a long time like allies, but now like China, they actively want to develop the relationship with the EU, for example, like the BRI programs in the EU, and also like the master system diplomacies under the COVID-19. And also like under the tension relation between China and the US, what the EU as a group attitudes towards to the like rising of China? So that's all my question.
I think the summit last Friday was nuanced in the sense that there were constructive messages being passed and they were clear and frank. I think that was also the qualification of the dialogue, right? Clear and frank, or open and frank. Messages have been passed as well on human rights, for instance. We do not see eye to eye. There is a certain need for China to take up. We would like China to take up a number of responsibilities. It being a global player, a very important global actor on the international scene with a veto in the UN Security Council. So it has to take up responsibilities, for instance, with regard to Ukraine and Russia. Those are messages I think that have been passed clearly, but it's also clear that the EU and China are important economic partners. We are X-fold as big as your relationships with the Chinese relationships with Russia, for instance. So we expect China to recognize the existential threat of what is going on with Russia and Ukraine today and act accordingly. Also from the perspective of almost a selfish perspective. If your important trade partner is under an existential threat because of what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, it will affect you as well, unless you act the way and you take up responsibility. That's a very important message. Now, are we as hawkish, if I can call it that, as the US would be with regard to China? I think less. I think we are perhaps a bit more nuanced, but we also, I think, started our relationship perhaps from a position of a certain wide-eyed enthusiasm of being able to develop a new partnership relationship. And that wide-eyed enthusiasm has to have a bit more focus, which I think is being put in place currently. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah,
we're somewhere in between the US and China, trying to make things work with China, but not pulling any punches on things that are really not really not worthy of international behavior, I would say.
And if I may, just to feel that China is not being singled out because it's China. I always remember in the 90s that we all diplomats I was born before I became ambassador in Berlin, saying that the Germans acted as if they were a Swiss canton. So it was as if they were a Swiss canton, and they thought they could get away with it. No, I think the Chinese have this tendency to act as if they were just a developing nation, one more developing nation, and only national interest account, and there is not a sense of global responsibility. And this is what my Belgian colleague is saying, and I fully subscribe that. I mean, if China wants to be a global player, they have to take global responsibilities and not only thinking in a the winner takes all attitude, which is sometimes our feeling.
Why is China still borrowing from the World Bank? We have some virtual questions and a few questions here in the audience, so we'll group them all together and so kind as to keep your questions short. Roddy, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. Some of you have had very distinguished careers in the foreign service and
Your name is?
sorry, oh yeah, my name is Eduardo. I'm a junior from Barcelona at American University, focusing on European-American relations. And my question is, what advice would you give to young Europeans who are watching or young Americans here who want to be involved in EU-US diplomacy?
And you, next to you.
Hello, my name is Nathan Matthew, and I'm also a graduate student at American University. A bit more of a hopeful question, since our discussion today is focused on shared norms and values, but how can the EU and the United States promote their shared norms and values? To echo Ambassador Garcia-Berdoy, is this an example of sausage slicing or is it more holistic?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I'm Danny. I'm also a second year grad student at SIS. My question is about like the potential like Marshall Plan, I guess, for Ukraine, and I guess like the assumption that the US would step up and like do that, but is there a role more so for Europe in this context, especially considering how like unbalanced the relationship can be between the EU and the US?
That's a perfect segue, because I don't know, you must have read the mind of the online question. They were asking, we talked a lot about imbalance in favor of the United States. And the question was there imbalance in favor of Europe in the partnership in certain areas.
On the
Yes.
what I think is the easiest one, which is advice. And you know, the first bit of advice is read a newspaper or read multiple reputable news sources which have different perspectives on a daily basis. But it's not just read them, I'd say cynically. Look for the bias, look for the overemphasis on some facts and not others. And the more that you do that, the more that you make sure both that you are aware of what's going on, but that you're not just sort of a consumer, but you're an educated consumer. I think that's the thing that more than anything else that prepares you to then find the issues that are particular interest, to wow somebody during an interview and to sort of claw your way in.
But to build on that, the best advice I ever got, I was a very young Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Came back from lunch, the Assistant Secretary was reading the Washington Times. I didn't say anything, but you must have seen the look on my face. Washington Times is very conservative. He said, young lady, it's important to know what the other guy thinks. And I've spent my life forcing myself to read opinion scholars, opinion shapers, whom I know I'm going to disagree with, but I feel they help me make better arguments. There's one thing I won't do in this list of Fox News, but I'm very serious. Whether you go into diplomacy or business or whatever, you've got to understand the other person's point of view.
Yeah, let me take the second one.
Also, study economics. Economics and finance.
The share values. Well, I mean, who did that? You. I think there are obvious questions that affect us all that should be shared in order to start talking about other things. And I think there are two things which are nowadays, for me, particularly important. Let's take the crisis in Ukraine out of the picture. One of them is environment, because environment is an existential issue for all of us. if we don't work together in environmental issues, but seriously together, not only because we are going to commit, but also we are going to help each other that the others commit in our mutual objectives, then I don't think we can start a serious conversation. And the second, it's, it might surprise you, but I think it's extremely important, the social contract. And what I mean the social contract, I mean that the erosion of the tax base in this globalized world, due to this digital economy, due to the new challenges of our global system, is such that in many cases, it does explain the rise of nationalism, the end of democracy, the destruction of the states that we were supposed to promote and the values that we were supposed to promote. If we don't share these two values, and I think on the second one, we have arrived to a kind of a landing zone. It's not the best, it's not ideal, but it's something. But if we don't get there in order to together to sanction loopholes in the financial system, to sanction the countries that are not transparent and that don't work together in fiscal justice, then it's better not to start talking about anything else.
I can only agree. Those are very wise words. I think I'm in the evening, I'm trying to work my way through a book called The Ministry of the Future. It's the best fiction, non-fiction book ever written, according to Jonathan Safran Foer, I believe, and heavily appreciated also in the blurbs on the book by President Obama. It's about exactly these issues. It's climate. It's us being one world, one people with one planet and finite resources. That if we do not find a shared platform to tackle those problems, we'll all be gone. It's a collective responsibility that we have. And that book makes an incredibly strong case for that sort of approach. It's way removed from institutionalisms, but it's very much worth a read. Now, on the question, the Marshall Plan for Ukraine, to be honest, I don't know the numbers, and I could totally be mistaken, but I have a sense that what goes into Ukraine today from the US side is those are huge numbers of money, but they largely go into the military. While what the European Union puts in are also significant numbers. They are probably not as high as the dollars coming in from the US, but they go into, I think, more the humanitarian and the refugee domain. That being said, I think in the meantime, people are getting ready to go back into Ukraine and reconstruct. So I think we'll see a whole competition going on to get into that market, because it's going to be huge, and people are I think getting ready and taking up positions to be there at the right time. Do we as Europe, do we have a responsibility to rebuild Ukraine? Yes, we do. Is it bigger? Is our responsibility bigger than the US responsibility in that sense? Without meaning to compare for ideological reasons, but yes, it is, because they are neighbors. They are right there. It's the same continent. So we have to take up that responsibility, and I hope we will be able to do that. I don't know. The last question was about: is there somewhere where we are better in the balance?
Yeah, well, comparative advantage maybe. We talked a lot about imbalances on one hand there, and if there is elements where it's the other way.
Last comments?
But this is a question of where there's an imbalance, where the European Union is in a position of strength vis-a-vis the United States. I mean, I think.
No, sorry. I thought that the question was more where do we get a most favorable treatment, and then we are in a, or where could you rightly complain about?
I see. Okay, I like my idea better.
I had understood it the way you understood it.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
And yeah, I would, the first thing that absolutely comes to my mind is the strength and diversity. The strength and diversity of cultures, approaches. Something that the European Union has is this space of a very real and ongoing dialogue among its members. And this is the flip side of what I was criticizing before. So that there's an ability to have a conversation and come to an agreed conclusion. And when I think many Americans, when we look at the situation in the United States right now, that it's so partisan, and it would almost be useful. I think many Americans are kind of looking for those things that force the parties together for a national interest. And the European Union has a little bit more structurally and a little bit more practice in finding that space of agreement, despite and even with the diversity of views.
27 different languages.
Probably a
More, I
few.
would say, yeah.
Well, yeah.
In our countries, we have a few.
It's very hefty translation bills.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lucrative branch of the EU to be in translation.
Less and less so, I'm
I
afraid.
think I'm hearing is that your diversity is a strength.
But not
As it is
just
anywhere.
that, I think, and going back to what the ambassador said about the tax base, I think what we as an EU or as EU member states still have, and which is an absolute strength, I think, is that we still have a social welfare sort of net that I think here it seems to me incredibly complex. It's not absent, but incredibly complex and with large holes in it. It seems to be tighter knit in the European member state countries with all the differences between them, but it's still there. I think that also explains why, yes, we have extremes on the left and on the right of the political spectrum, but in the end, most of them do not want to blow up the system because the pull of the system is still towards the center to conserve that thing and to strengthen it. That's why I think keeping an eye on these tax bases and preventing the shrink is important, because it is the basis on which a social fabric exists also, and because there is this social fabric, there are bridge points to others and to this unity, to this diversity rather, as a strength, because it could also be very much a field of lots of clamor and noise, but not necessarily.
We are out of time, and I want to thank these wonderful panelists and just ask you to keep one thing in mind. Yes, it's easy to complain about different aspects of the EU. They're not doing this or they're not doing that. But remember that for centuries, Europeans fought each other and killed each other. And look at what we have today. An area, an economic area that is GDP roughly as large as states, democracies, wonderful, along with Canada, our most important trade partners and security partners. And it's amazing how Europe has come together. When I was your age, European Union was narrowly a union. Now look at it, a common currency. So keep it in context. Thank you to the panelists, been wonderful.